Well, here's our follow-up to what was now week 11 of our major words from our minor prophets. And today we had the opportunity to look at Zechariah. And what's cool is Zechariah is the most quoted prophet in the New Testament because of all the messianic references. And what's been interesting is to see is how Haggai and Zechariah tied together as contemporaries. And even as Ezra mentioned some of the similar things. And it's always great to see the Bible intertwine and how they relate to one another. Often people think guys just wrote these things down, but we see God's Spirit, as it says, working in the hearts of these authors to pen these very words, and we see the correlation throughout them all. And what's been interesting is we looked at last week and this week, and then next week we'll finish out this series. It's all about rebuild. And we looked at last week rebuilding the temple from Haggai's perspective, and this morning was more about rebuilding worship and what that really looked like. And we kind of led in last week to what this would be. But Zechariah is broken into two parts. And this morning we looked at the latter part with the messianic prophecy. But the part we didn't get a time to look at was the first part. And it pertained to Zechariah's visions. And when you first read it, maybe like me, you skim through Zechariah because it's just one of those minor prophets and you're reading, and as you've heard us reference numerous times, you don't always preach on the prophets. So this has been a pretty cool series, but these are some crazy visions that Zechariah has, and they all have meaning to what's to take place. But at the core of it, all of them relate back to the fact of worship. And as we see throughout these books we've looked at the last 2 weeks, there's Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel, who is the governor at that time of Jerusalem. And they are now part of these dreams as well as the men who have to carry out what's said. And we see that a lot of what happens in these visions is pertaining to getting Israel's attention. Hey, here's the things you've done. You lived in sin. Everything's been destroyed. Yet, as you read in this, you find that there's the one vision where the golden lampstands, there's 7 of them. And then there's 2 olive trees that pour oil to keep them burning, which are Joshua and Zerubbabel. And so as we think about those things, why is it that they would use visions, and why are all these things in there to begin with? Well, it goes back to Genesis. In Genesis, it starts with God using dreams and visions to communicate. And he continues to do that throughout Scripture, all the way through Revelation with John when he puts him into a sleep, and he has what's going to take place in Revelation, as we talked about today, the correspondence of Zechariah to the end of Revelation. And so what I really wanted to focus on, and just briefly in this time, we don't have near the amount of time in this video to go through all of these visions, but just to highlight the fact that God was trying to speak a message that pertained to his people of the time, but that was a message of prophecy for down the road. And it goes back to what we talked about last week was, here's the people that have been in captive for 70 years in Babylon, and they're released, and they come back, and Jeremiah alludes to the fact of when this would take place, and once again, the scriptures corresponding. But now that they're back, as we talked about, they want to rebuild the temple, and they begin to do it, and they kind of become discouraged and stop. But then along comes Haggai, who says, hey, here's something greater that you're going to rebuild. And they end up rebuilding the temple, nothing like Solomon did. But then Haggai and Zechariah said there's going to be a rebuild of worship on a person who's going to walk the earth, the Messiah, the one that's been prophesied about all throughout Scripture in Isaiah and the other prophets. Here comes the Messiah, the chosen one. And so as we see this, everything is kind of, Zechariah takes what Haggai said, and he kind of does this little intertwining of, hey, Israel, you got to get right. You got to fix your hearts because one is coming. And here's the kicker. If you don't, it isn't going to happen. So I need you to be obedient for this to happen. And despite everything that Israel's done over time and how we kind of mock and make fun of them for some of their stupid things, we do the very things. But Israel wises up, and because of that, everything comes to fruition. All the prophecies, the visions, everything is fulfilled. And as we know in the New Testament, the Messiah comes, Jesus Christ, the one who will save all the people from their sins, the only one who can do that. And so as you go through your study today, whether it be in a life group or individual, think about this, that what's taken place is God's trying to get the attention of his people. How often is he trying to get our attention? What does he use to get our attention? And do we listen? Because it's easy to read something and kind of view the Monday morning quarterback and say, well, they didn't get it. That was a dumb move. But we do the same thing in our own context. So what I would encourage you with as you read this is to think about, what is God trying to say to you? And I don't think it's necessarily maybe in a dream or vision like he did with Zechariah, but is he trying to get your attention? What's preventing true worship in his church today? And when his church today, I don't mean just here at Morgansville, but his universal church. What's getting in the way? And what needs to change and for us to be more obedient? Because as we saw this morning in the second half of Zechariah, it all points to the future when Christ sets up his throne. So I hope as you go deeper, it encourages you. And I hope this series has encouraged you. And I know we've enjoyed it and we look forward to wrapping it up. But if you have any further questions, please reach out and have a great afternoon.